Welcome, friends. Today we are going to take a little bit of a closer look at sourdough starters. A few weeks ago, I made a video about how to create and cultivate your own sourdough starter for use at home. And I realized that there are a lot of questions about that method. And there's a lot of conflicting information in general about sourdough starters. Not every recipe specifies what kind of sourdough starter to use, what the hydration level should be. And there are two schools of thought about creating and feeding or keeping a sourdough starter alive. Now, I am someone who advocates that if you are baking, you should be using a scale. You should be weighing your ingredients. But when I showed you making this sourdough starter, I used measuring cups and did everything by volume. And here's why. 40 some years ago, when I was taught to make my first sourdough starter, we had a neighbor when I was growing up who was from Austria, and he was a master bread baker. Had an amazing shop in Toronto, did booming business. His breads and pastries and everything else were just off the charts fantastic. He taught me how to make a sourdough starter because I wanted to learn how to make bread. And he showed me by volume. And so that's just the way I've always done it. And he taught me that of all of the things where you need to be precise, the starter wasn't necessarily the one area that you needed to be super precise about. That this was the art form. This was that wild card that you needed to learn how to tame and use, and sight and smell and touch were more important in bread baking than scales and exact measurements and flow charts and spreadsheets and all of that stuff. It's more of an art form, and it's about learning the touch, smell, and see when you're baking. So I've always done it that way, and I've always continued doing it that way. And so I call this 100% starter because that's what he called it, and that's what I learned. But I know that for those people who love spreadsheets, love flow charts, love exact measurements, this isn't 100% hydration. This is actually closer to 122% hydration, which means there's slightly more water than flour. And what does that mean? In the grander scheme of things, absolutely nothing. I've spoken to a lot of professional bakers over the last couple of weeks just to make sure that I had a real good handle on this and I knew what I was talking about. And they all said over the course of the year, their 100% hydration starter will actually fluctuate anywhere from 90 to 110 or 115. And at 122, as long as you sort of get a feel for the bread, it's going to be fine. So for those of you that want to make stuff on a scale, then of course you do a 1-to-1 flour to water based on weight. For those of you that want to use it as an art form, it's 1-to-1 based on volume, and you stir it and you smell it and you know what it's going to be, you know what its health is, and you might use a little bit of less water at certain points, and you might add more water at certain points. Which leads me to this one. This is what I call a 50% hydration. It's actually 61 or 62% because, again, I do it by volume rather than weight. And this is a stiffer starter that you use for certain breads. Now, the problem is, of course, when I look at a lot of bread recipes, they just say starter. They don't specify whether it's this sort of lax fluid starter that is 100% hydration or this much stiffer one. And I'll show you. So the stiff one is definitely stiff. It's, it's a levain. It's like bread dough, completely like bread dough. Whereas this one is much more like pancake batter. And so for a lot of sourdough bread baking, the trickiest part is deciphering, is it a stiff or 50% hydration levain, sourdough starter, whatever you want to call this. There are proper names for it, but it sort of gets muddy out there. People use words interchangeably that probably they shouldn't. Or is it this 100% hydration version? And that difference in hydration can really make or break the bread you're baking. So you have to be careful. And so here's a choice that you need to make. Which school of bread baking are you going to follow? And I think, I believe that right up front at the very beginning when you're first starting out, you probably should be the spreadsheet kind. You probably should use a scale. You probably should weigh everything until you sort of get the flow and you understand what this should feel like and how it works in the bread. 4 or 5 months in, you're just going to be eyeballing it. You're not going to be measuring anymore. You're not going to be weighing anymore. You're just going to be making it on the fly. So at the beginning, by all means, weigh it. Then you're going to switch over and it's going to become an art for you. And it really is an art form. So, where was I going with that? If you're trying to make a sourdough starter, look at all of the information that's available to you and just understand that there are two schools of thought and that conflicting information really isn't in conflict. It's just people who are tightly regulated and people that are artsy-fartsy and are just sort of like, it'll all work out. And you know what? The truth is somewhere in the middle, but I have found that it'll all work out. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.